Okay, welcome everyone. So welcome to people in the room and welcome to the people virtually. We've got the pleasure today of having a presentation from Peter Wharmby. We first listened to Pete at a National Autistic Society conference a few years ago in Birmingham. We're very impressed with his presentation style, and he was talking about being a teacher, and I'm sure was an absolute inspiration for a lot of his autistic pupils. Also caught up with Pete again at the Edinburgh conference. It Takes All Kinds of Minds, which he was doing some work there. He is no longer teaching, but has turned his hand now to doing lots of presentations like the one today. I followed Pete on LinkedIn. I've explained to him, I hope that doesn't sound too creepy. He does some really interesting posts on there. And he is an author. So there are two books that I'm aware of, Pete, that you've written. The first one of what I want to talk about, which, as those of you that have either been diagnosed or work with Axia know, that we value people's interests. We take those as really important and meaningful. And I think Pete clearly does in this book. The other book he's written is called Untypical, and how the world isn't built for autistic people and what we should all do about it. So that's the second book, and I'm sure there's going to be more books. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to you, Pete. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay. It was all working before, so I'm just hoping it still is. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to talk today. I think that the idea of post-diagnostic support is something that needs to be encouraged as much as we humanly can. I remember very vividly when I was diagnosed back in 2017. I was after days and days split over a kind of month or two of having to bare my soul and explain and talk about everything that had ever happened to me. The psychiatrist was like, right, yeah, I can confirm, you're autistic. Congratulations. And handed me a bunch of photocopied leaflets, most of which kind of directed me to, I'm pretty sure one of them directed me to the Wikipedia page on autism, which was a bit of an interesting move, in terms of looking for support. But a few fairly out-of-date books and things like that were on there, and I think a couple of chat rooms that didn't exist anymore, and things like that. I didn't feel enormously well supported. I kind of left the hospital, grounds kind of dazed and bewildered and thinking, now what? Now what do I do? I've just found out that my life is very different in this very big way, and there's nothing. So to find out and to be aware that there are services such as this that offer proper support for people who've just been recently diagnosed, including talks like this by somebody who's been diagnosed for a while and who knows a bit about the topic, it's just fantastic. And I hope it really does help today. Me rabbiting on about special interests and how they work and what they're good for and what we need to be mindful of, and so on and so forth. So yeah, thank you very much for coming. So we're gonna talk until about 10 to 1, about 12:50. We're going to talk until, and then we will have a quick kind of 20-minute break and come back at 10 past. And then I will carry on until 2 o'clock or so. What I recommend and what I suggest is that after the break, when you've had a cup of coffee or you've had a bit of lunch or whatever it is you want to do, if you've got any questions, if anything's kind of filtering through your mind and you want to ask a question at 10 past 1 before I get back into the swing of things, then please do. I think that's a really good opportunity to ask anything that might be on your mind. And I'll try and leave a bit of time at the end as well, so that we can do a bit of a Q&A at the end too, because there'll always be questions. I won't be able to cover everything, and I mean I'm autistic and ADHD as well, so the likelihood of me forgetting something is fairly high. So it might be that you want to ask a clarifying question or something along those lines. I was at doing a talk in Camden Town yesterday. Well, no, Kentish Town technically. And I'd mentioned that I was going to talk about something, and then probably forgot to. And one of the people, asked a question at the end, was like, can you tell us what you were going to, add about that topic? And I was like, thank you. Yes, excellent. I won't be offended or upset. If I miss something, or if you want a bit more extra detail, just ask. That's fine by me. Okay, right. So yeah, on this slide, as you can see there, my two book covers, they both came out really quite recently. It's a very kind of quick fire experience for me. The first book, what I want to talk about, that came out in September of last year. So that's been out for just over 6 months now. And that really is going to be kind of fundamentally the core of what I'm going to be talking about today. Hence why the color scheme of the slides kind of, reflects that. Because it is a book that's entirely about my special interests. I managed to convince a publisher to allow me to talk about all the things that I really like in a book, and they were like, so that was quite nice. So every chapter is a focus on a different stage of my life. So it is a bit kind of biography-like, but I try to avoid it being too detailed in that way. But it's a different part of my life and a different one of my kind of more enduring special interests. So, for example, the first chapter is all about, kind of me at the young age and Lego, which is one of my most long-term special interests. I mean, I don't know whether you can see, I'm surrounded by the stuff at the moment in my den in the attic. And then chapter 2 moves on to dinosaurs, and chapter 3 moves on to video games, and so on and so forth. I'm a very stereotypical autistic. I do apologize for that. I'll talk later about how varied and tremendously unexpected special interests can be, and yet here I am loving my trains and video games and Lego. It's like, if you wanted to design an autistic man, here I am. Anyway, so that's how that book works. And then the second book, Untypical, that came out very recently. That came out in March. And it's a much more general view of autism. It's kind of designed to be kind of pushed into the hands of non-autistic people, to try to get them to understand a bit better. I don't know whether it's having that effect. I hope it is. I hope it does. Time will tell, I suppose. But that's available too. So if you enjoy this and you think, oh, I'd like to read those books, then by all means do. They're available wherever you want to get a book from. If you don't like Amazon, you can get it elsewhere. So not a problem. So yeah. So that's the books. Now I'm just trying to find the little book. There we go. Okay. So what we're going to look at then, I'm going to do a bit more of an introduction about my diagnosis, then talk a bit about what special interests are from my point of view anyway. I'm then going to talk a little bit about something called monotropism or monotropism, which might be something you've come across, or it might be completely new to you. I mean, it just depends. Yeah, who knows? It's a relatively new thing, so it's possible, especially if you've only just been diagnosed, that you might not have come across that before. In which case, it might be quite useful, quite helpful. Then we'll take a break. Then I'm going to talk about the kind of benefits of special interests and how they can really help autistic people, and ADHD as well. There's an interesting crossover with special interests where and hyperfixation, where it is an autistic thing, but it is also really an ADHD thing too. It's quite interesting kind of overlap. And then we'll finish by just thinking about some of the possible pitfalls and challenges that special interests can throw up. So we'll have a kind of deeper look at that towards the end of the session. Okay, and like I say, we'll have that break and the Q&A in the middle there. Okay, so a little more about me then. I don't know why I put the picture of that particular Lego person. They don't look like me at all. In fact, I think they're female, but I just like the photo. It's a really nice picture. I like taking pictures of my Lego. I just do. There's something very pleasing about Lego photography, in my opinion. So there's a Lego person looking. I think the idea was that this Lego person was meant to be doing that thing that we all probably do, where we walk into a room and forget why we're there. I think that was the idea behind the picture. I think I kind of capture that. Anyway. So I was diagnosed in 2017 before the pandemic, and I was 34 years old. So you can figure out how old I am now. So there you go. And as I say, my first book on hyperfocus came out in September. My second book came out in March. And I used to be a teacher. I was a teacher for a very, very long time, from about 2008 or so until 2021. So 13 years or so. I taught English at a straightforward secondary school in Wiltshire, and worked an awful lot with autistic students even before I was diagnosed. It was very interesting how I was kind of singled out and chosen very frequently to work with what we call, and I don't like this terminology, but what we called like bottom sets. You know, the idea of the bottom set. You know how, you know, kids are kind of put into sets for English for GCSE, you know, just kind of telling them bluntly just how good we think they are at a subject. I was very frequently given the lower sets, especially ones that were kind of filled with boys. And very frequently they were autistic. There were a lot of autistic students in those classes. And I found that I had, you know, a really good kind of affinity with them and worked with them really well, and often help them get the best outcomes. And I had no idea why. I just thought, I don't know, we just kind of get each other, you know, it's fine. I accept them for who they are, and there's no problem there. And, you know, the classrooms were always really, really positive environments. And then when I got the diagnosis, it was like, oh, okay, well, that kind of explains that whole thing. Because I don't know whether you've looked into this much, but one of the most interesting things for me about autism is communication. And the fact that autistic communication is different to non-autistic communication, almost on a kind of cultural level. You know, things like eye contact, facial expressions, using implication, hinting things, passive aggression, all those kind of things are done differently with autistic people compared to non-autistic people, generally speaking anyway. But it's an interesting thing that when you get autistic people together communicating, a lot of the problems that you get, or the challenges that you get when you're trying to get autistic and non-autistic people to talk, they just kind of fall away and drop away, and they don't exist. Autistic people communicating together are often fine. You know, it just works. It's just interesting that perhaps that's what was going on. You know, I was communicating, obviously. I mean, teaching is communication. I was communicating with these autistic kids as an autistic person myself, not knowing it, and that worked. It just worked. You know, it was successful, and it operated well. If you are newly diagnosed and you haven't, as of yet, had the opportunity to, I don't know, just go and sit with, you know, be friends with another autistic person, just, you know, the two or three of you or something like that, and just kind of enjoy how different it feels. I mean, not always, obviously, people are very different, but it is an experience when you first have, like, I don't know, like a night at the pub, or they come and watch a movie or something, or, you know, just spend some time with somebody who's also autistic, and you communicate and you talk, and it's like, this is different. I like this. You know, this is kind of working okay. It's an interesting experience. So yeah, and I bring my experience of teaching into everything that I do. I mean, obviously, it's helped very much with what I do in terms of speeches and talks and training. I do a training. I do training with I don't know if you've heard of Autism and the Anna Freud Centre. I'm delivering training on a weekly basis for the NHS to people that work for CAMS. So people that work on wards and in care settings for autistic kids and autistic teenagers, just trying to raise understanding of how those environments are quite difficult for autistic kids. So I like to think that my teaching experience kind of adds a lot to that. So, but you can make up your own mind about that, I suppose. So yeah, that's me, really. If you want to know more about me in detail, then obviously you can read the first book, and that goes into kind of scary detail. So you'll know an awful lot about me if you were to do that. Okay, let's move on then. So what are special interests? I do want to preface all of this by saying that I like the term special interest, but I'm also very aware of the fact that not all autistic people do. I get that completely. So if you're sitting there thinking, you know, I don't like that term, then fair enough. You know, I'm not going to argue with you. You know, that's personal opinion. That's everyone's take on things. But I do just want to offer my kind of reasoning behind liking it. I enjoy it and I use it, and I'm kind of a little bit, I suppose, fighting to keep it something that we can use, because I just think it works. And I'm not a huge fan of how the word special has changed and has been kind of dragged away from its original meaning. And I'd quite like to try and, rescue it from that, because we very often now associate any word like special, particularly special, with a kind of, it's that euphemism, isn't it? You like special needs, for disabilities. That it was very popular in the 90s and the 2000s, that we didn't call it disability, we called it special needs. Which, I'm a great believer that the word disability is fine, and that works, and that's a word that we should own and work with, and that euphemism to special needs was kind of annoying and not very helpful. But I don't want to lose special interest a lot. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think special interest works as a term, because the interests are interests, no arguing there, and they are special in the original meaning of the term, being kind of important or powerful or different or unique or unusual, or however you want to interpret the word. I just think it's a really useful term. It's a shame to lose it. And some of the other words that we use instead, like monotropism or hyperfixation or hyperfocus, are great, but they mean something slightly different or slightly more specific or whatever. So they're not a great kind of replacement, if you know what I mean. So that's my thinking. But if you're thinking, I really don't like it, then that's fine. I'm not going to try and persuade you any further. We're all allowed to have our takes on language. But what are they? What are special interests? Well, fundamentally, they're tremendously intense interests. They are very comparable with hobbies. They often are hobbies in their own right, obviously. And there's nothing kind of specifically neurotypical only about a hobby. Special interests are hobbies, that they are, but they do differ from, I suppose, the neurotypical experience of hobby in quite a few different ways. Okay. And a lot of those ways that they are different from just what you might call a standard hobby are to do with extremity. I don't know whether you've noticed yet, especially if you're fairly freshly diagnosed, but a lot about what ought to be autistic is to do with extremes. You're either hyper something or you're hypo something, the opposite. Then there's not so much being in the middle. It's like you're either hypersensitive to, I don't know, light or sound or touch or something like that, or you're hyposensitive and it just doesn't bother you at all. You don't even notice it. You're either, hyper aware of being in a social situation and get really anxious, or you're just, completely like blasé about it and barely notice at all. It's an interesting way of looking at autism. And I think the special interests are kind of hobbies, but turned up to 11. They're like extreme hobbies. And they're extreme because they kind of take over a little bit, especially if you let them. I describe it in the first book as like they're always in the wings in your mind, waiting to take center stage again. They're kind of currently really into it. And I just think back to being at work. There was a period of time where I was head of department of English, which is not a job I would wish on anybody. But I would be leading meetings with my department, in my classroom after school, tired. And I don't know, maybe there'd be a video game that I've been playing recently, or maybe I was really into a certain type of train at the time, or whatever it was, it would be there. I'd be trying to do the meeting and it would be there, kind of almost like shouting, like, or whispering in a really aggressive way, what about me? What about me? Think about me now. Think about me. And I'd be trying desperately to stay on topic and to focus on, grade boundaries and league tables and, or what we're going to do about such and such in set 2 or whatever. And I'd have this insistent thing going on in my head where whatever it was I was interested in at the time just wanted to be focused on, really strongly, very distracting. And I look back at some of my notes from that time, some of the meeting notes that I'd kind of written, by hand. and just the doodles, the doodles everywhere on that bit of paper of whatever it was I was fixated on at that time, which just everywhere. You know, I was clearly trying to let it out by just drawing the things, you know, so there'd be like a train going over a bridge, or there'd be like a map of the video game world, or there'd be Lego bricks, or there'd be a guitar or something. I was desperately trying to kind of release it, get it out somehow, because I knew I couldn't just start talking about it, not in the middle of a meeting. So I had to let it out somehow. So it's there. They're very, I don't want to use the term intrusive because that sounds too negative, and I don't want to make special interests as negative as that, because I don't think they deserve to be seen that way. But to be fair, it is a good word for it. You know, they are a bit intrusive. They're pushy, I suppose. They're pushy. You know, they want to be front and center. But it's not all bad. You know, though they do want that, they do want to be at the forefront all the time. They have such tremendous use in terms of regulation, like self-regulation. It's a very interesting thing about autistic people that, again, it's all about extremes, where we can be fairly poor at self-regulation, especially when it comes to physical sensations. For example, I don't know whether you've come across the term interoception. Interoception is one of our kind of other senses away from the main five that we talk about, which is all to do with being able to kind of interpret your body's messages. So to keep it simple, like, you know, am I hungry right now? Am I thirsty? Where's that pain coming from? Why do I feel like this? You know, that kind of thing. So in some ways we can be fairly bad at self-regulation because we don't necessarily know what it is we need, because interoception can be a real problem. But on the other hand, we're enormously good at regulating ourselves. We come up with all kinds of different ways and schemes to do this. A really good example of this would be stimming. You know, not random, but, you know, kind of repetitive movements that we do to just to keep ourselves on the level, keep ourselves nice and calm. I've usually got a Lego figure that I just kind of fiddle with, pull their legs off, put them back on, poor thing. You know, just constantly kind of moving as a way of just keeping my stress levels under control, keeping myself, you know, just my head above water kind of thing, you know, and stimming is really good for that. We learn to mask as well, which isn't always that useful because it's exhausting, but it can really help us get through difficult, you know, social situations. But we also have our special interests, and they can have a wonderfully regulatory role as well. You know, if things are getting too much for me, if I'm really, really starting to feel stressed, then I know that if I open Wikipedia or just take a moment to just look at some of my favorite things, you know, and read about trains or read about something that I really love, my stress levels will reduce. They will, you know, almost visibly, you know, just kind of start to drain away again. And that's something I wouldn't give away for the world. You know, that's such a powerful tool. I always had either Google Maps or Wikipedia open at work on my computer. Google Maps, because this is another one of my things. It didn't make it into the book, actually. I couldn't think about much to say about my fascination with maps. It's not a very interesting topic, but I love them. And if the class were being tricky, or I was just really tired, or I'd been up late looking after my, you know, young baby at the time, then, you know, just get the kids working and then just taking a few moments just to look at some maps. It just worked. You know, it just helped so much. Makes you wonder what happens when special interests are removed from a person, especially autistic children, especially at school. You know, when they're told, no, you can't, don't focus on that now, you got to focus on this, you know, and they lose that positive impact. They lose the regulatory aspect. It could be quite difficult. So yeah, they come with tremendous positives, and I'll look in even more detail at that after the break as well, of course. But what can be a special interest? It's an interesting thing to think about, really. There's a lot of stereotype here. There's a lot of misinformation, and I think the general public's understanding of autism is such that if a lot of autistic people were to disclose what their special interests were, you'd almost have people be like, no, that doesn't count, or but you can't be autistic if that's something you're interested in, you know, because the understanding is just not there. People tend to think that it's always going to be things to do with, like I say, trains, aeroplanes, you know, for some reason, modes of transport, maybe sciencey stuff, you know, things to do with science in some way or the other. Maybe, I don't know, like computing, video gaming, obviously. It's that kind of thing that tends to be the public idea of what an autistic special interest is. But the reality, as far as I can see, is that autistic special interests have no limitation at all. They could be anything. You know, if it's possible, if it's a thing that you could class as a hobby in any way, then it's very likely there'll be an autistic person somewhere who has that as something that they are deeply, deeply interested in. You know, passionately into. And I think that's really important for everyone to remember. You know, when a person comes up and says, actually, my special interest is something to do with sport or dance or looking after horses or, I don't know, embroidery or collecting fossils or whatever it might be, yeah, that's fair enough. You know, that will count, because anything can be a special interest. And certainly, I'm sure we've probably got a really broad range of different interests in the room at the moment. You know, I'm sure that's the case. As I said at the beginning, mine do tend to be fairly stereotypical. You know, that's just the way that it is for me. But you know, that won't be the case for everybody at all. I know plenty of people for whom special interests are very non-stereotypical. You know, all kinds of things. So yeah, don't feel limited, and never feel like, well, you know, I really like this, but does it count as a special interest? Well, I mean, only you can decide that. That's up to you. You know, and the stereotype is that, you know, we are kind of, I don't know how to put this. Whenever you come across special interests in the media, on TV shows or whatever, you know, and I always kind of end up thinking about things like Big Bang Theory here, you know, with Sheldon. Autistic special interests always come across as fairly comical and a source of, you know, humor, and that we are kind of boring. You know, that autistic special interests are boring for those around us because we like to go on about them, and they're fairly closed off and other people aren't interested. And therefore, it's kind of funny. Oh, look, they're going off again about their thing that they like. How funny that is. And though there are, I mean, admittedly, there are kernels of truth there, I suppose, you know, fair enough. There are a few bits and bobs in there that might be fairly accurate. It's not the full picture at all. I mean, first of all, of course, the vast majority of autistic people, once they reach maybe their teenage years, have learned that it's not socially acceptable to talk the way we want to about our special interests. We've been told too many times to shut up, to stop going on about that thing, maybe by parents, by teachers, by friends, you know, and by everybody. So, you know, we fairly quickly learn not to do that. So, you know, it's autistic adults, for example, you know, really letting off, you know, really talking about their special interest to somebody who isn't interested, I think is probably actually relatively rare. You know, we've learned not to do that. But equally, often autistic special interests can become something that we're so passionate and knowledgeable about that we can make a career out, you know, as I'll talk about later. So actually then the info dumping, like for me now, you know, weirdly for me, on a meta kind of level, autistic special interests are autistic special interest. And here I am being allowed to talk about it and info dumping it, you know, as much as I want. And that's great. So it's not always, you know, oh, here they go again, they're going off on one. You know, sometimes it can be a bit more nuanced than that. However, I will always say that, especially with autistic children and teenagers, they, you know, there is still that love and that wanting to just offload. And I've always said to non-autistic people, parents, teachers, that kind of thing, that if they can find it in themselves just to listen, just to really just like be an ear and just take it in, it can work. It can be such a huge benefit for the autistic individual. You know, just feeling listened to, feeling like somebody else cares about the thing that you are so deeply passionate about can go an awfully long way. So yeah, just something to bear in mind. You know, I think it can be very, very powerful. Anyway, so how do they work? Well, there is a kind of, there's a hyper focus at work when it comes to special interests, a kind of sense that when you're engaged in them, that the whole world can pass by and you'll barely even notice. You know, you're so fundamentally 100% focused on that one thing that you're doing that everything else just drops away. And I guess that's where some of the regulatory power comes from, because a lot of autistic people's stress is external. Not all. We have, you know, there's anxiety and all kinds of things that can be internal sources of stress, but a lot of it is external, especially like sensory stuff. That's, you know, all external by definition. And also, you know, communication and environmental stress, that all comes from outside of ourselves. So when we engage in a special interest, we are shutting that world out for a time, perhaps. This is speculation, but it is something that I really do, you know, think is a definite thing. We're cutting the rest of the world out so that we're just focused on that one thing that we really love. So for a time, maybe the sensory overstimulation drops, maybe our anxiety about social aspects and communication drops because we're focused on this one thing. And obviously by its very nature, it's something that we love. So that has its positive impact too. But that hyper focus is tremendously powerful. And I'll talk about it in more detail on the next slide when we talk about monotropism. It's incredible, really. And I think, you know, people often talk about superpowers, don't they? It might be something you've come across. It might be something you believe in. You know, autism is a superpower. I always like to say, well, not always. You know, for me, autism isn't always a superpower. Sometimes it can feel very different. And ADHD definitely doesn't feel like a superpower to me at all, apart from in very rare occasions. But I would say that hyperfocus does feel like that a little bit, because it's so hugely beneficial and it's so potent. You know, I mean, my books, being ADHD as well, writing a book is not easy for me, because I get bored very, very easily. I mean, it's a wonder that I do these talks without just kind of wandering off halfway through, because I'm always just so kind of desperate for the next thing, you know? So writing a book, I tend to write them in very short, very intense bursts. So I'll like sit down and just write for 10 minutes, often just on my phone. You know, in fact, I mean, this book was written entirely on my phone, which I'm told isn't totally unusual. You know, these days, I think a fair few writers do, but certainly, you know, it's not the standard way. You know, a book written entirely by thumb, you know, isn't entirely normal. But that was because I could only do it when I felt in that kind of mindset. And I would only be in that mindset for short periods of time, except when the hyperfocus struck. And then on those rare occasions where hyperfocus managed to coincide with me writing, I would do like a whole chapter, you know, in one sitting. Okay, I'd have to go back and rework it a little bit, but it would just flow. It would just happen. So yeah, as it says on the second bullet point, productivity. It can be a tremendous source of being incredibly productive. I just think that if it's blended with ADHD, as it is in my case, that productivity can be fairly short-lived, but it's better than nothing. You know, it really is better than nothing. So yeah, that's something to really celebrate, I think. When you're in that zone, you know, it can be really very, very powerful indeed. But it can also, as I said earlier, be very distracting. You know, and my difficulty as a kid, especially, you know, before I had the kind of willpower, I suppose, and I still don't have an awful lot of that now, was just that they were like a magnet pulling me away from whatever it was I should be doing all the time. I mean, I vividly remember the feeling of, you know, like working on homework, you know, at any age, you know, from you know, year 7 all the way up to like year 13, or even being at university, and really struggling with it because always I was fighting the need to go and do one of the other things. Always, you know, like I have to tell myself even now, if I'm writing, don't open Google Maps. Don't do it. Don't do that. You know, you've got to get a few more words on the page. Don't start, I don't know, looking at the architecture of London on Google Earth. You know, don't start doing that, because if you do, then that will be it for the rest of the afternoon, and that's that. Then, you know, you've lost the day again. So, you know, it's a difficult balance. You know, you want it because you want the regulation, you want the peace that it brings and the calm, but equally it can distract away from maybe things that you really do have to do because, you know, the world insists that these things need doing, unfortunately. Another thing, though, that I think is interesting is that they can take us a little bit out of our comfort zone. And I talked about this in chapter 4 of this, you know, the first book, when I talked about my special interest in music, which was relatively short-lived, I suppose. Most of my special interests have lingered for a long, long time, never really gone away for good. But my interest in writing and playing music was relatively short-lived. It lasted for probably about 6 years or so. But in that time period, I was completely focused on it, and I loved it. You know, writing music on guitar, and I ended up being in a band and all sorts of things. And these were things, getting up on stage and performing music, especially in my early 20s, was something that by all rights, I shouldn't have wanted to do. I was, and still am to an extent, an incredibly shy person. I know, you know, despite all of this, you know, because believe me, after this, I will have to go and decompress in a quiet room. You know, I struggle, you know, I struggle with it. And especially in my early 20s, the idea of, you know, getting up on stage and singing and playing guitar should be ridiculous and just a no, obviously not. But for me, the special interest just kind of pushed me that little bit further. It allowed me to explore things that were slightly outside my comfort zone, which was very powerful. And yeah, I'll talk about that a bit more after the break when we look at the benefits. But it's an interesting side effect of special interests, I think. And it will be interesting to wonder, actually, you know, just how far that can go. You know, how far can special interests allow us to experience things that we would normally be too scared or too nervous or too anxious to try, you know, to experience. And the social lubricant part there is to do with the fact that very often special interest can be an opening into socializing, into spending time with other people in a way that we might not be able to otherwise. It's a mistake to believe that autistic people are loners and solitary souls. Some of us are. I mean, I am, you know, very much so. You know, I love being alone, but that's not the case for every autistic person by a long stretch. I'm increasingly a believer of the idea that actually there are plenty of autistic extroverts. It's just that we have our kind of extroversion maybe kind of beaten out of us by all those miscommunications and difficulties that we've had, you know, where we just kind of end up naturally trying to defend ourselves by just staying away from people, perhaps, but we still need people. You know, we still need socializing. We still need friends and to go out and to meet people sometimes. And special interest can be a way into that. You know, if you've got a shared interest in Dungeons and Dragons or going to game sports or going to gigs or something, you know, then that's a way that you can do things with other people. And that can be really, really good, you know, really good way of maintaining those social relationships that might otherwise be quite tricky, you know, given how many of us suffer from social anxiety and anxiety generally. You know, it can be really, really good. Okay, I'll move on. Let's have a think and a talk about monotropism. So it is a relatively new term. One of the most interesting and important things about it is that it's almost entirely an autistic-led theory. Now, that's fairly new. Back in the day, autism theory was always kind of told to us by neurotypical people, you know, often making fairly not great assumptions, you know, about things, leading to theories such as theory of mind, you know, autistic people not having theory of mind, autistic people having extreme male brain. You know, they were very popular theories for a time, you know, and yeah, makes you wonder. But this is a theory. This is a bit of research that is fully led by autistic individuals. autistic scientists, autistic researchers, and so on and so forth. Led by Dr. Dinah Murray, who sadly passed away a few years ago, but the torch has very much been passed to her son Fergus, who works a lot on this. It's a very key kind of thing for him. I suppose it's about as close as we've got to a kind of grand unifying theory of autism. You know, like what's at the heart of autism? Why is autism the way that it is? Why are we the way we are? It comes close to answering that, I think, in very persuasive ways. And the idea is that autistic people are monotropic. Okay, and what that means is we have a single mono focus, tropic, single focus. And I've already alluded to this. It's part of the whole hyperfocus idea. But the idea is that our brain is structured in such a way that our attention is only ever going to be directed at one thing at a time, very, very specifically, and fairly forcefully too. Whereas non-autistic people are what we would call polytropic or polytropic for obvious reasons. Yeah, many, poly meaning many. You know, they can't necessarily focus on everything, but they've got a broader kind of range of attention that can take in a few different things. And once you really get your head around this idea that we do have this kind of tremendous tunnel vision almost, although not quite as negative as tunnel vision, but, you know, this real single focus, then an awful lot starts to make a lot more sense. Because it certainly helps to explain special interests and hyperfocus, because that's what that is. We're hyperfocused because the entirety of our brain is focused and fixated on just the one thing, rather than being separated out and blending. It's like, you know, the reason why a laser is more powerful perhaps than just a light bulb. You know, a light bulb emits plenty of light, but in every direction at once. So it's dispersed. Whereas a laser is a lot of light, but it's all zoomed in on just one very tiny point. And, you know, under right circumstances can presumably blow up planets and stuff. So, you know, laser, it's like that. It's like laser focused. And it means that we can kind of receive and transmit an awful lot of information on that one thing. You know, an awful lot. There's a lot going on in that mood, in that monotropic focus. And we can enter what's called a flow state, where we become so kind of comfortably focused and fixated on that one thing, whatever it might be, that it just flows comfortably. And we can enjoy a period of such tremendous productivity and input, like, you know, reading and taking it in, or output, you know, creating and putting things down on paper or on a computer or whatever. That's really something special, you know, tremendously potent source of energy and creativity and thought, I suppose. And it's an incredible idea. You know, the other thing is, you know, it helps to also explain things like our sensory sensitivity, because if you imagine that, you know, how I talked earlier about how, you know, we can be tremendously sensitive to sound, but not have a problem with light, for example. Well, maybe that's because when the sound enters like that laser, that focus, when it enters that and we get it all like full in the face, like whatever that sound is, it's just like boom, like that. That's why we get overwhelmed. It's like, whoa, it's too much. Whereas we're ignoring maybe things that are going on elsewhere. It's interesting to think about, you know, maybe sensory sensitivity is what happens when those sensory stimuli enter our monotropic hyperfocus and we're just kind of blown away by it. A bit like when, what is it now that happens? It's in The Simpsons when Bart strings together a load of megaphones and then says something into it, and it blows the windows out of the entire town, you know, because it's so noisy and everyone's got tinnitus for, you know, the next half an hour or something. It's a bit like that, you know, something enters into it and it's like bang, you know, really, really strong, powerful sensation that can be quite unpleasant. Another interesting thing about this, and this will probably be the last thing I talk about before we go to break, is that it helps to explain something called autistic inertia, which you've probably come across. Even if you don't know what it's called, you've almost certainly experienced it, which is the phenomenon whereby autistic individuals can find it really difficult to switch tasks or switch focus. we very often really struggle to go from one thing to another quickly. We can do it, but it just takes time. And what often happens is that the people around us don't have the patience for this, and they get cross with us for taking too long to go from task A to task B, because they don't understand what's going on. What's going on is that we've got to kind of gradually withdraw our hyper focus from the one thing, from task A, completely, like bring it all back in again, and then put it all back out again. And it just takes time. There's nothing we can do about that. There was a great cartoon, like comic strip, that did the rounds a few years ago by, what was their name? I'll have to look into it over the break because I don't want to mention it without giving them the credit. But an autistic kind of cartoonist, comic book creator, did this wonderful image of it being like tendrils that come out of our brain. Don't know if you've seen it, like tentacles or tendrils that kind of lock on to the thing that we're interested in. It's lovely. It's like, that's the flow state. Like all of our brain is connected. And trying to get an autistic person to go from that one thing to another is like ripping the tendrils out, like tearing them, rather than letting them gently retreat back into the head, only to then go back to something else, which I think is a really nice kind of visual shorthand for what it is we need. The other metaphor that I used in the more recent book, in Untypical, was that autistic brains are a bit like a motorway. Our attention is a bit like a motorway, as opposed to non-autistic attention being more like roads in a city. So their minds are relatively, it sounds awful, and I'm not trying to suggest that non-autistic people are silly or, don't have good brains or something, but just bear with me. It's like non-autistic brains can switch focus quite quickly, in the same way that you can change direction relatively easily in a city, on the city streets, because there's loads of junctions and traffic lights. If you want to go left, you can go left. You just go, just do it. Whereas an autistic brain is more like a motorway. You can't just turn left, at that speed, because if you do that, you're going to crash. And they'll be like, junctions on a motorway aren't like right-angled junctions. It's not like just a quick left handbrake turn and just, take your chances, see if you make it. They're very purposefully built to be tremendously gradual and gentle, with plenty of warning. You get the signs 2 miles out saying there's a junction coming, there's a junction, be ready. And then you have the countdown, 3, 2, 1. I loved that as a kid. It's great passing those as a kid. I always thought something great was going to happen. Turns out you're just turning off to go to Basingstoke or something. But anyway, you have that warning, and then the slip road is very gently curving, and you can slow down a bit. By the time you change direction, it's been like a 10-minute process, to make that happen, because it's a motorway. That's like an autistic brain, in my opinion. We need that same level of warning. We need that same gradual, gentle switch. And we need the people around us to be able to give us that space and give us that time to really manage that task switch. Because otherwise, well, what happens? Well, I saw it at school all the time, with autistic children. Meltdown, not being able to do it, refusing, and all that kind of thing. And of course, back when I was a teacher, before I got my diagnosis, I was sympathetic to this, but I didn't understand what was going on. And certainly it was possible for teachers to get quite cross. Like, why can't you just stop doing that and start doing this? And that was made even worse by the fact that at that time, I don't know whether it's changed much, but at that time, Ofsted very heavily pushed that lessons should be very fast-paced, with loads of different activities, like bang, 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 do this, now do this, now do this. Now get into groups. And that's like the last thing that an autistic kid can deal with. It's an absolute nightmare. But that's how things work. And adults are the same. We don't suddenly become good at this. Autistic adults just still need that same time to go from one task to another without being judged. Without being kind of accused of being either obstructive or difficult or foolish in some horrible way. That's often what's leveled at us. The fact of the matter is, it is a fundamental way that our brain works. And it shouldn't even necessarily be disabling. Not really. It's only disabling because in our culture, we're meant to be able to switch tasks because that's what polytropic people can do. Well, good for them. Well done. But we work differently. And there's no shame in the way we work differently because, quite frankly, the way we work has its own benefits, enormous benefits that can potentially benefit everybody. If somebody starts hyperfixating on cures for cancer and stuff like that, that can only be a good thing. Anyway, it is 10 to 1. So I'm going to take a break now for 20 minutes. Okay. You can enjoy a bit more of my Lego photography. Have a think. If there's anything you want to ask, any questions of me at 10 past, then please do. I'll be happy to answer those things. And then we'll pick up again in 20 minutes or so. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.
Okay. I've got the chat open. I saw that somebody's put in the chat that their special interest for a year was skydiving, which I think that says it all, doesn't it? That's certainly not the stereotype, autistic special interest, but I do like the sound of it. I also saw that somebody had said something along the lines of that ADHD acted as a kind of brake on hyperfocus, which I think is actually a fair way of looking at it. Yes, yeah, it certainly does seem to have that effect. It almost kind of naturally stops me from getting too hyper-focused at any given time. So yeah. Right, I'm just seeing, I think a couple of questions have already popped up, actually. This was it Kate? Yeah, Kate. I wonder if one reason many women and girls missed out on diagnosis was because they are stereotypically thought to be able to multitask. And conversely, it was always assumed men couldn't multitask, but maybe it's an autism or ADHD thing. I mean, yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, who knows? I mean, these stereotypes probably didn't hold a huge amount of water, but there were certainly things that people believed. Definitely, people truly thought that was the way that it was, that, men can't multitask, whereas women can. And I think it'd be interesting to think about how autism, ADHD kind of slots into that and how much of a part maybe that has to play in those stereotypes.
Pete, welcome back. And we've got, similar to what you were just talking about, we've got a couple of questions in the room as well. We spoke about ADHD and autism. We spoke a bit about the Panorama program that I don't know if you saw.
I haven't seen it yet. No,
right.
no.
Okay, so
putting it off.
Yeah, we spoke a little bit about that, and we've got somebody in the room who did have a brilliant question, but is worried that when I now ask them that they're going to forget what. Oh, they've written something down. So can I just go and get what they've written down?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Hi, Pete.
Can you hear Pete?
Hi. I was asking Linda. So I've got an ADHD diagnosis, and I'm fairly sure that I'm autistic. I really got the analogy of needing a motorway. Needing that kind of change really, really slow. The key word being needing, but my ADHD brain swerving like it's in a high-speed police chase most of the time. And I just wondered how, but then my brain can't catch up. I can't catch up with myself. And I just wonder if you have any suggestion about how to deal with, how to kind of regulate that need to move slowly from one thing to the other, but when the ADHD part taking over and swerving you and having to flip from thing to thing to thing.
Yeah, it's exactly how I feel as well. I mean, it is precisely that. I feel like I need that space and time, but equally another part of my brain doesn't. I've described being both before as ADHD and autism being in a kind of strange dance where sometimes they, as they're kind of moving around always, sometimes they kind of complement each other and kind of slot together in a way that works. And for whatever reason, for that period of time, everything is kind of, this is good, this works, this is nice. But then they'll move again and they'll be kind of in opposition or at odds with each other, and it will feel like, you know, like a battle, you know, just getting anything done. You know, things just become incredibly difficult. And to be quite honest with you, I mean, I wish I had solutions. I really do. It's such a difficult thing. I mean, I haven't even got diagnosed with ADHD yet because the waiting list is so long. And so I'm having to kind of, you know, be self-diagnosed with that. I mean, I'm confident, but, you know, I don't know for sure. But that means I can't, for example, try medication. I mean, I'm not a huge advocate for massive amounts of medication in any situation, as you know, because it can have adverse effects. But I would certainly be very interested to feel how it feels to have the ADHD part, you know, well medicated, like medicated in a way that was sustainable and healthy, just to see what it felt like. If I'm honest, it's just curiosity, because it's tiring to have that constant fight in my head. You know, it really is very, very hard work. So yeah, I'm not the best person to ask for advice on that, because I struggle with it so much. I mean, what I found really helps is kind of being alert to it, knowing that it's a thing, accepting that it's a thing. And I'll just find myself sometimes just kind of sitting on the sofa saying, no, come on, let's just focus on this one thing for a time, then do that in a bit. Or let's do whatever that thing is that part of my brain wants me to do, just get out of the way, and then I can focus on the thing I need to do. It sometimes helps, you know, sometimes, not always by any stretch. But yeah, I mean, you certainly have my empathy, because, you know, it is a very difficult way of trying to get through things. You know, it's hard. It is hard.
And the final question from the room, Pete, was around where people have their monotropism, but actually they're spending far more money than they've got, and the house is becoming... So the example, is it all right if I give the example of a house being overcome with Airfix models, and people calculating how much over the years they've spent on their intense yet transient interests, as people like me like to talk about them. Well, I don't like to, but talk about them.
Yeah.
Okay, Pete, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I sit here in my room that's literally filled with Lego, and Lego's not cheap. And kind of thinking about, oh God, if I actually sat down and tried to work out how much I've spent on the stuff in this room, I would almost certainly end up crying. It's part of what a lot of people call the neurodiversity tax. It's the kind of collected amount of money that we all seem to have lost over the years because we're neurodivergent in some way. So that's money that we lose from being forgetful, perhaps, or from not being able to make phone calls, you know, to cancel stuff, from missing appointments, from, you know, going overdrawn without realizing it because we daren't check our bank balance because I don't know, you know, there's all kinds of different things going on there. To even to, you know, to things like them to spend more money on medication or even alcohol and things like that, you know, for people who try to self-medicate, which sadly is obviously pretty common within the neurodivergent community, especially for some individuals. And then, yeah, money that we spend on, especially as you said, you know, as Linda said, transient special interests. That's where it really hurts. It's one thing spending money on a special interest that maintains, you know, and I'm just grateful that I've never lost my love of Lego. You know, at least it still brings me joy. But it's when you fork out a load of money on something that seems the be all and end all, you know, something you're so fascinated in and you need to have in your life. And then for whatever reason, a few weeks later, it just vanishes. It's just gone. That special interest no longer exists for you. And you're left with God knows what equipment or stuff. And you've got like less than zero interest in it anymore. And it's that can be very hard to handle. You know, how do you deal with that? And I've just seen on the chat, someone said, Lee's just said, there's groups on Facebook to sell or swap your special interest items, which sounds like the best thing I think I've ever heard of. That's fantastic. You know, just that is a great example of now that autistic and neurodivergent people are able to be a bit more ourselves, you know, and create communities for ourselves. You know, we come up with stuff like that, you know, which is so specific to our brains and how we work. But it's brilliant. You know, I had no idea that was a thing. I'm really chuffed that does exist because, yeah, you know, you spent a fortune on, I don't know, fishing equipment and then lose all interest. You know, how do you get that back? Well, you can swap it for, that's good. That's good to know. In terms of keeping the house together, yeah, I've reached a kind of natural point where I've told myself I can't buy any more Lego because there's literally no more surfaces in the house to put it on, unless you count the floor. And that's a slippery slope. So I'm not counting the floor. Okay, I daren't count the floor, because if I start down that road, then that's that. So I've managed to find like a hard limit on that, you know, so that helps me control it a little bit, you know. But with ADHD in particular, there's a very strong evidence for ADHD and kind of compulsive spending being a very strong thing, being a real issue actually. So yeah, if you happen to be ADHD too, then it can combine in fairly unhealthy ways. So that's when you need, I suppose that's when it starts to kind of, is it addiction? You know, even if it's not itself addiction, maybe addiction related kind of help might be useful. You know, even if technically it's not an addiction, it might be that kind of thing that could be useful. Just in order to kind of try and break that cycle, because it can go wrong pretty quickly. But I think self-knowledge, I mean, yes, somebody's just said, actually, let me just check in the chat. I think just as I was thinking it, I've only managed to curb my spending after being diagnosed and medicated for ADHD. So there's something to be said for self-knowledge. You know, I think once you find out why you're doing something, that it becomes a little bit easier to not do it. You know, it kind of helps the willpower a little bit. But obviously, yeah, if you're also medicated, that presumably helps a great deal too, because you've no longer got that urge, presumably, you know, to just splurge or to whatever, you know, and lose all your cash that way. So yeah, it's a tricky one. You know, it's about finding a hard limit that you can try and stay true to, like I am with my lack of surface space. And ignoring that part of my brain which says, but you know, what about other options? What about the floor? You know, just ignoring that and trying to stick with that very clear, natural barrier, you know, that exists. But beyond that, it's hard to say. And I was going to talk a little bit, I will talk about it still a little bit, you know, in the final slide, some of the possible pitfalls of special interests, you know. So yeah, it's, yes, Avril's just said, with ADHD, we need the dopamine hit, and that is why we're sometimes impulsive and overspend. And yes, I know that feeling all too well. The bane of my life, if I'm completely honest with you, which I will be because I'm autistic, is mobile games. You know, microtransactions. You know, where you're playing one of those stupid games which are like, you know, oh, you use gems to speed this thing up that you don't even need and nobody cares about, but you're just like, yes, I need that to happen. So, you know, you spend like a $5 here and there, and then you check your bank balance at the end of the month, and it turns out you spent over £100, and you just think, oh my God. Yeah, I do worry sometimes that those kind of predatory economic models disproportionately affect neurodivergent people. I've no idea what kind of research there is into that. I doubt there's not much money in research like that. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if that disproportionately hit, especially people who are ADHD, because it tickles that part of our brain in that perfect way, you know, and it's devastating, you know, it really can be. So yeah, there are real issues there, I think. Anyway, somebody's just said, I spent literally hundreds on microtransactions in one evening. Yeah, I've been there. My happiest moment was finding out that Google Play does refunds. And as long as you don't mind losing access to the game, because they'll ban you because you've asked for your money back, I think for a period of maybe a week or two, you can go back and ask for everything to be refunded, and then you just cut the game off. I did that with one game once, and I got a fair bit back, and I've never played it since. And that felt good. That was a bit like sticking it to the man, you know. It's like, I got my money back, and I don't care about you anymore and your foolish Marvel superheroes. Anyway, happy times. Any other questions before I move on to the final couple of slides, because time ticks away. Just going to check the chat.
No, I don't think so. Oh, there is one more question.
Okay.
I don't normally do this. Do you think that the likes of Amazon and the shopping channels and such actually target people with Asperger's and ADHD?
God, I mean, you'd hope not, wouldn't you? It's very hard to say. I think it's possible they might be doing it accidentally. To be honest with you, I doubt that their knowledge of autism, Asperger's, ADHD is good enough for them to purposefully target it, because, nobody seems to know enough about it. But it wouldn't surprise me if they're accidentally benefiting from it a great deal, that they've kind of hit upon this kind of golden way of getting money out of people that just works so much better for them on neurodivergent people. So things, for example, like the 1 month's free subscription model, okay? Very standard model of trying to lock people into a subscription, hoping that they forget, hoping that they just think, oh God, I can't be bothered with the phone call to cancel the subscription. Who's that going to affect more than anybody else? Neurodivergent people who don't want to pick up the phone, who are far more likely to forget they ever did it, who are liable to put it off or to get distracted if, ADHD, get distracted before you actually cancel it. I don't think they're purposely targeting us individually or, as a culture yet, but they certainly are basically doing that by having these practices which, disproportionately affect us a vast amount. Like I say, I think it's unlikely they're doing it on purpose in terms of targeting autistic people, because I just don't think they know enough about us to be able to do that, because I don't think they'd have very much interest. But I do fear that if they really did get that, if they really did kind of realize that it could get an awful lot worse, actually, and that there might be, they could make millions if they really wanted to specifically, purposefully target neurodivergent people, which isn't a happy thought at all. So it's certainly food for thought, but certainly as things stand, that it still is having a detrimental impact. And I would say to anyone who's, especially if they're autistic ADHD, to stay away from free trials like the plague. Just stay away from them, because the amount of money I've lost over the years is just horrific to those things. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll get cracking on, because we've got half an hour left, and I do want to have 5-10 minutes at the end in case any further questions come up. Okay, so I'll carry on. So where am I? So there's the break. Here we are. So let's talk about the positives. It's nice to focus on the good stuff, and a lot of this I've already kind of referred to briefly, but I'll go into a bit more detail now. So first of all, you've got the idea of flow state for productivity. Okay. I'm a huge hater of something that's increasingly happening in the corporate sector at the moment. Anyone who's on LinkedIn might have noticed this. You know what LinkedIn's like, whereby people are trying to increase private companies' interest in autism by selling our skills and trying to make us sound like we're brilliant, that we bring something special to the workforce. I don't like that very much, because I don't feel like it's fair that autistic people have to be kind of, we're only tolerated because sometimes we think outside the box. It just doesn't feel right. It doesn't fit well with me. I would much rather us be, accommodated for and made adjustments for just because, that's the right thing to do. But, we've got to be realistic, haven't we? However, having said all that, it is a case that flow state is obviously going to be productive, whether you're at work or whether you're doing your own thing. If you manage to get into that monotropic flow state, then you're going to be getting an awful lot done. So, if it's an individual hobby, an individual special interest that you're doing just for your own benefit, then obviously you can get an awful lot done there. Interesting how many autistic people find ways of monetizing their special interests, actually. It's fascinating to me on platforms like Instagram and YouTube, how many individuals have managed to successfully monetize things like their train sets, or their kind of model railways, or their or doing makeup videos, or doing anything that could actually potentially be a autistic special interest at work. So that's an interesting thing to consider, that we tend to be so passionate and so creative and so dedicated to these topics, and because we spend so much time on them, we get pretty good at them as well. Autistic people are often expert in all kinds of odd fields, yeah, in this new economy that we work and live in now, monetizing is possible, and it's fascinating how frequently that happens, I think. So it's about, you know, there is a real benefit there, financial, but also just for self-confidence, for self-contentedness, you know, to feel like you've done a really good job on something, to enjoy time spent on something so single-mindedly that, you know, afterwards you feel calm and rested and like you've achieved something, you know. And I think special interests can really have a huge amount of opportunity to give us those very positive, nice emotions. And as I've alluded to, special interests can very definitely lead to careers. I have a special interest in literature that I've had since I was a kid. You know, specifically for me, I suppose it's kind of Victorian literature, you know, slightly older stuff, especially if it's to do with urban spaces. I've just got utter fascination with it, always have had. And I managed to turn that into a master's degree. You know, I did my master's degree in literature on representations of London in Victorian literature, which was, you know, you might be sitting there thinking, oh my God, but for me it was bliss. You know, it was wonderful. And then became a teacher, which is kind of turning a special interest into a job. And now I'm a writer, which is again turning a special interest into a job. And I'm not the only one. You know, you've got all those people for a start who are monetizing their special interest skills. You know, they might not be open about being autistic, but actually often they are. There's this very funny, very dark Instagram, Twitter account that I follow, who creates these really nonsensical and bizarre kind of advertisements and kind of posters in the community that are really weird and like quite sinister, but they're very fun. You know, they're very well made and they're very, very enjoyable. And he last year came out as being autistic, and I was just like, yeah, there we go. He's made a successful career on his interest in creating unnerving artifacts. You know, I mean, God, I mean, imagine how lucky they are. What a lucky guy. But yeah, it's not unheard of at all. And yeah, I mean, all these video gamers that are making millions of pounds, millions of dollars, whatever, in streaming their gaming, you know, there must be a neurodivergent population in amongst them. I'd be very surprised if there wasn't. So it can very much be a way of making a living. So that's something, that's a good thing. As I said before, regulation of mood and stress levels. I mean, God, autistic people, you know, if there's one thing autistic people tend to need, it's that. I spend my entire life in a state of extreme stress because of the peculiar kind of alignment of my sensory issues, my sensory sensitivities, and my and the interplay between ADHD and autism, meaning that I'm very disorganized. You know, my life is just chaos and stress and very, very difficult. It's amazing that I ever actually remember to come to these things, you know, and actually do them. I'll forget one day, I know I will. So having something that can just help with those stress levels just a little bit is obviously going to be enormously important. It's just interesting to me how frequently both autistic children and adults have their special interests either taken away from them forcibly, like, I don't know, banning your child from playing on the Xbox anymore, or in a more subtle way by mockery or just continued disinterest or not being supported with them, to the point where you've still got the interest, but you can't indulge in them because you'll either get laughed at for it or nobody's going to help you out with it or give you a lift to go somewhere or whatever it might be. You know, we don't get the support, so we cease to be able to utilize them. And then what happens? You know, if we haven't got that way to regulate ourselves, and we're not allowed to stim, are we? You know, if we're in neurotypical company, you know, stimming is apparently not okay, even though it hurts, you know, usually hurts no one and is relatively inobtrusive. But you know, it just feels sometimes like autistic people have their self-regulatory ability just removed from them for no good reason. We're just not allowed to. And then we get told off for having meltdowns and shutdowns. It's very unreasonable. Doesn't sit well with me at all. There's huge benefits to education if encouraged. You know, autistic children, special interests, they're They're in a zone of education when they're in a school, so use it. You know, I was always discouraged as a kid. My special interest back then was the Titanic. I mean, it still is to an extent, but back then it was a big one, you know. And all I ever wanted to do my schoolwork on, when I was given kind of free choice to do it on a topic, all I ever wanted to do was do it on the Titanic. And I wasn't allowed to. They literally just wouldn't let me, like, because, I don't know, because I always wanted to do it, I suppose. They were like, no, you need to show more variation. It's like, well, you know, this is a project which is designed to help my writing ability. Let me write about something that I love. It will be better as a result. Seems like a no-brainer, but, you know, there we go. There are those social benefits that I've alluded to as well. I think another one of the special interests that I talk about in the book is another very stereotypical one, but I'm going to use it because it's a really good example, I think. In chapter, bear with, 5, it's a whole chapter on my kind of teenage years and my love of miniature war gaming, you know, Warhammer, that kind of stuff, 40k, Necromunda, all that kind of business. And just while we're on the topic, I'm fascinated. If anyone has any reason why they think that autistic individuals are often so fascinated by miniature things, I'd be very interested to know what you think about that. Because you see it a lot. I mean, it's not across the board, but seems to be an enduring fascination with things that are small. You know, model railways, dioramas, Lego, miniature gaming, Airfix models, you know, all that kind of stuff. Things in miniature seem to be very popular for some reason. And I've never landed on a reason why that is, not successfully anyway. I've come up with ideas, but I'm just not sure. But anyway, Warhammer. Now, Warhammer is a fascinating hobby because, and anything like, you know, wargaming generally is fascinating because it's both simultaneously incredibly solitary, but also incredibly sociable. And it's very easy to control the amount of each that you do. Because you've got the solitary aspect, which is where you're painting the miniatures, you know, carefully, arduously with a magnifying glass and a tiny brush, you know, putting that detail on, and you're building your armies. I used to love doing that with a calculator, working out what my army was going to be and how many points all the different soldiers cost and what kind of an army I could have. You know, you'd spend hours doing that completely on your own. And that was solitary time. But then, of course, you've got the collective, everyone getting together and playing some games. You know, everyone coming to a village hall every Thursday night and setting up the tables and actually playing the game that the miniatures are designed for. It's a really good example of a special interest that just works for both sides of the coin. But it gives autistic individuals who may well have a lot of social anxiety, who may well find masking difficult, who may well have a long history of trauma, of, you know, social interaction going wrong and, you know, just not wanting to go there anymore and finding it very difficult, or feeling that people don't like them, and all these things that many autistic people know all too well. You know, something we all, I think, can empathize with. But then you've got these safe spaces, like a bunch of almost, you know, majority neurodivergent people probably getting together to play some games, you know, to do a bit of our kind of socializing. And the way that, in my experience, autistic socializing is different is because very frequently it's parallel play, walking side by side, not so much sitting together looking at each other, you know, often just two people doing something quietly on their own, but together is often some of the most lovely social moments that autistic people, you know, from my understanding and my experience and from who I've spoken to, tend to enjoy. And special interests so frequently open up opportunities for that might not exist otherwise, because the world is set up for neurotypical socializing. You know, the world is set up for, you know, how they want to do it. So it's more difficult for us to find ways that we can do it in a way that makes us feel good and that we're comfortable with and feel safe in. And yeah, the special interests offer these things all over. I suppose the only difficulty is when we have special interests which have a large neurotypical taker, you know, because then, of course, we might experience the same old challenges and difficulties. You know, One of my special interests for a very long time was football, which is interestingly one of the special interests that neurotypical people are allowed to have, and they don't seem to see anything weird about the fact that they know their team's players dating back to the 1940s. Apparently that's fine, that's not weird at all. Whereas if we happen to know the names of people that died on the Titanic, that's seen as weird and creepy and non-desirable or whatever. But I was really into football. I'm a Leicester City fan. And my period of my most interest in the game actually wasn't recently. It was back in the late 90s, the Martin O'Neill years. And I loved it. I was fascinated by it. I knew everything about the team. I was utterly immersed in it. But it's a very neurotypical culture, and I didn't feel welcome in any situation. I mean, obviously, I was only a late teenager anyway, but I didn't feel comfortable going to games. I didn't feel comfortable in the pub watching them on telly or anything, because it was very neurotypical. So there are difficulties there. That is a thing. But when you have a decent number of autistic or otherwise neurodivergent people coming together to do these special interests sociably, it can just be such a powerful and important way for us to get that social interaction that we need, or that most of us need at least, in order to stay happy and healthy and whole. So yeah, never discount that. And then finally, as I talked about earlier, it pushes us out of our comfort zone, or has the potential to. And that can be just, getting us in a room with a load of other people. I often felt that going into I used to go to a church hall in Lincoln to play wargaming, to play Warhammer. Quite busy, Lincoln's a city. There are quite a few people that played. And it was always a bit intense, going in there and just being a bit like, oh God, so many people. But the activity, the interest encouraged me to go and pushed me out into something that wasn't my normal comfort zone. And I enjoyed myself as a result. I blossomed. I was happy, and I'd always come away from it, with a big smile, thinking, yeah, that was great. I really enjoyed that. That was good stuff. So that's something that we don't want to ignore, and like I said, anything that managed to convince me that getting on stage, singing and playing guitar was a good idea. I mean, that must have been a very powerful special interest to lead me to do that. It's interesting to note that since that special interest died, which it really did, sadly, I haven't done anything like that since. I haven't sung in front of anybody for a very, very, very long time. It's not like I've carried on doing open mic nights or something like that. I haven't, because the interest has gone. So its ability to push me out of my comfort zone also appears to have gone, which is interesting, I suppose. So yeah, there's a whole menu there of positivity, I think, of reasons why special interests should be really celebrated and viewed as a tremendously powerful positive in the lives of so many autistic people, in a way that I don't think is very often noticed, or talked about, especially for children, unfortunately, because they're always, made to feel like their special interests are lesser, or, not good enough, or weird, or too niche, or whatever it might be, when, actually it could be really, really beneficial for them for all of these reasons. Okay, right, I'm going to move on to the next slide then, and we're going to have a little bit of time left, I believe, for a bit more Q&A if anyone has anything further to add. Doesn't even have to be a question. One interest, it might just be an observation. That's fine. Doesn't have to be a direct question. Okay, right. Possible pitfalls and challenges then. Well, first of all, because special interests are so intrinsically linked with monotropism, you've got the challenge of inertia. Inertia is something that can be managed, as I said, with the motorway model, give us enough warnings, give us that gentle, movement to doing something different, and we will, generally speaking, be fine. But unfortunately, the world really isn't set up for that. The world isn't built for that. And in some situations, as much as it pains me to say it, in some situations, the world probably couldn't even be very easily adapted to be okay for this. Just as an example, I was in London yesterday. I went on the Underground for the first time in probably 10 years. And I used to be very good on the London Underground. I used to find it relatively straightforward. I'm very map-based, so I love the Tube map. I think it's a work of art. It's beautiful and works and it's just amazing. But I really struggled yesterday, really struggled, because I was finding myself perpetually going into hyperfocus when I was sitting on the tube. And as my journey involved a couple of stops and changes, unfortunately, that caused me some real problems. So I was kind of having to leap off the train at the last minute because I was kind of, I suppose, neurotypical people would say, away with the fairies. I mean, I wasn't, unless those fairies are fascinated by Victorian architecture. But that's where I was. I was fixating on, the brickwork of the Circle and the Metropolitan line outside the windows, just really focused on that and nearly missed my stop a couple of times. So there are some times where that inertia, there probably isn't a huge amount that we can do about it. We're just going to have to try and find ways to manage it, because they're not going to, I don't know, could they? I suppose they could give us more warning, couldn't they? The tube actually does. It does say next station is blah, 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 but it never really gives you much of an idea about how far it's going to be. And because you're underground, it's very difficult to tell. It's just darkness. Maybe there are ways. But anyway, needless to say, inertia can be a real challenge and it can be very difficult to manage, especially if the people around you aren't sympathetic or aren't patient or aren't, reliably autism informed. They're going to get impatient, they're going to get cross, they're going to think you're messing them around and all this kind of thing. And then the shame spiral starts and things start to get quite rough. So there is that. And I would always recommend to any autistic or ADHD person out there that if they have disclosed at work, if they've felt comfortable to disclose at work, which obviously we don't always feel that we can do, but if you have, then make that one of your adjustments, or at the very least, sit down and talk to your line manager, your boss, whoever it might be, about this phenomenon, and just be clear with them, just say, look, I can task switch and I can do loads of different things, but I might just need a bit more time to move between the two. I mean, you'll have to judge for yourself how well that will be met. It'd be lovely to exist in a world where the boss would be like, oh, okay, that's cool. That's great. Yeah, I can do that. Sadly, I fear that a lot of the time the response might be more along the lines of, this person can't do the job, therefore let's, dismiss them, which is totally unfair and ableist, but sadly, the reality that we live in. Judge it, your workplace, but I would always recommend it if you feel that you can. Just be really open about that this is a thing, and if given appropriate support, there won't be an issue at all. And you'll be productive as hell because monotropism, you'll focus. There's also possible links, I suppose, with all of this, with PDA. And I always hesitate to mention PDA because there's a certain level of controversy that surrounds it, because some people don't believe it exists, some people think this, that, and the other, and people disagree. PDA, if you don't know, is something called pathological demand avoidance. Not a great name. Pathological, not a very nice term, but it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's something that I have myself. Basically, where anytime anyone other than yourself asks you to do something, you have a kind of instinctive kickback of no. Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter how beneficial it might be or how small it might be or whatever. There's just a kind of instinctive reaction of hostility to it, like, no, don't tell me what to do, no, leave me alone. Which can be challenging for everybody involved. And when I speak from my own experience, I really can't control it. Like, it will happen. Anyone can ask me to do, if you ask me to do something, it will happen. It's just how much of it I display to you is the only thing I can control. And as an adult, I'm able to hide it. To hide the thought process that goes on in my head, which is along the lines of, leave me alone, immediately. I just hide it and I'm just like, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll do that. That's fine. Okay. Yeah, fine. Okay. And off I go to do it. Obviously, children might not be able to do that and they might just refuse point blank. And that can lead to huge problems. I don't know whether you've come across it. This might be something you've experienced yourself. It might be something you know about, or that you've got somebody who who is PDA. It's relatively common, I think. What nobody can agree on is what it actually is. Like, is it an inherent part of autism? Is it linked to monotropism? I keep calling it monotropism, monotropism. I still haven't landed on which pronunciation I prefer, so I apologize. Is it to do with hyperfocus? Is it to do with inertia? Or is it a trauma response? autistic people doing it basically because they've been traumatized and they, stop telling me what to do, leave me alone, because of bad experiences in the past, perhaps, of misreading into instructions and getting things wrong and therefore fearing that happening again. And it's called demand avoidance because that's what happens. You instinctively start to avoid anyone asking demands of you, so you kind of retreat into yourself, or you pretend to be otherwise engaged, or you pretend to not be able to do the thing so that nobody asks you. It's interesting how it might be linked with inertia and hyperfocus. I can certainly see where the link might exist, because if we're fully engaged in something and somebody comes along and says, oh, can you just, I don't know, get the post, or I don't know, something really innocuous, it's intruding on my flow state, it's intruding on my focus, and it's asking me to change task too quickly, and I can't handle that, so I react with hostility kind of by default. It is certainly worth bearing in mind that there could be a very strong link there, I think. There's the interaction with interoception as well, like I talked about earlier. Because autistic people's interoception isn't always great, we don't necessarily always know when we're hungry or when we're thirsty or when we need the toilet or whatever it might be, because we can't, for whatever reason, the kind of interpretation of our body's messaging just doesn't work as well, or it works differently at the very least. What that can mean in practice is that we might be a bit more likely in our times of hyperfocus and flow to forget to eat, to forget to drink, to get dehydration headaches as a result, to forget to go to the toilet and end up getting ill from that, infections or whatever. There's all kinds of ways that you can probably imagine that could branch out into quite negative outcomes. If we're not doing what our body needs because we're so fixated on our stuff. So it's always worth having. I tend to get by it by having a kind of reminder. It sounds really silly, but if I know that I'm going to be doing something that I'm likely to get very focused, really getting that flow state with, then I might leave myself a reminder, like on my phone or something, something that will beep and tell me to go and get a drink. But luckily for me, because of the ADHD, I don't often get into that state for long enough for it to be a problem. But if you do, then if you can be in flow state for hours and hours and hours on end, then might be worth bearing in mind. I had somebody I knew very, very well a long time ago, when they were a kid. I don't actually think I don't think they're diagnosed as autistic, but I wouldn't be surprised if they ever were. When they were a kid, they played a video game so much for such a long time that they ended up having a DVT, because they were sitting still for too long, which I think is a pretty good indication of, just how hyperfocus and that kind of, monotropic, single-mindedness could have bad outcomes. So that's worth bearing in mind. And finally, what do you do if somebody fixates on something that's unsuitable, a dangerous topic? And this is something that I'm very concerned about, because the internet exists. And, if you were to want to get really fascinated with, I don't know what, there's hate groups out there, hate groups, any kind of hate group you can imagine, anti-Semites, transphobes, Nazis, white supremacists, whoever they might be. What happens if that becomes a focus? What happens if that becomes something that, a monotropic motorway of interest? And that is something that I spend probably more time worrying about than is good for me, because I know that especially for autistic boys who might lack, role models and stuff like that, there is a real danger, I think, that these things, things that are very bad, very dangerous, could become fixations. I'm not saying that, this is uniquely an autistic thing, because it really isn't at all. This sort of thing is a danger for everybody. But, you can see where the possible interaction could happen, where a real hyperfocus could start to click into place, and then, how difficult it might be then to stop that becoming a real problem. In which case it's everyone's job, vigilance is everyone's job, just to make sure that children, in particular autistic children, are monitored in their internet usage as much as is reasonable, just to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen. But I haven't got any answers for it. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and it's such a difficult topic that I've never come to any kind of useful conclusion about it. But, you know, something to think about as you leave today. Anyway, time is almost up. We've got 5 minutes left. So, are there any final questions or things you want to mention? I've noticed the chat's been going. I can't read it all now. I've just seen, just by chance, Amy saying, I think gambling should be spoken more about with people with autism as an addiction, as it isn't taken as seriously as other addictions because it's not as dangerous. And yeah, God, yes, absolutely. You know, I mean, you know, microtransactions in video games. Yeah, I mean, it really, you know, that's gambling. Often, you know, you're paying to open like boxes, aren't you? Loot boxes that open up, and there's a possibility of getting something shiny and amazing, and you don't, obviously. So yeah, real danger. And then, of course, you know, more serious forms of gambling as well. Could be a real danger. Lots of people talking about poetry, which is lovely. What is the name of the Instagram, Twitter account you mentioned? Oh, the sinister, horrible humour. Trigger warning, seriously. This stuff is dark and weird. But it's a guy called, oh God, what's his name? Bear with. He's usually got a story open at the top of Instagram. If he hasn't now, I'm just going to have to find it later. Oh, I can't find it. I'll have to get back to you. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's like a single word. But yeah, it's very, very odd. Yeah, you have to have a fairly dark and maybe autistic sense of humor to enjoy it. You know, it's a bit unusual, but it's good. What else have we got? What about when a special interest is focusing so much on eating and this becomes an eating disorder? Yes, yeah, that was actually something that I intended to mention briefly. It's not something I know an awful lot about. There are people out there who are much, much better informed on this than I am. People like Cara Lissette. If you come across Cara Lissette online, she's an expert in this. You know, the autistic interplay with eating disorders. So look her up. But yeah, that is a very real thing. Yes, a hyper focus on calories taken in and types of food eaten and that kind of thing can lead to some not good outcomes. So that is a really serious thing. Like I'll just type her name in here so you can have a look. I think I'm spelling it right. I'll put it in the chat. Somebody said I have a very dark autistic sense of humor. Yes, indeed. I don't know whether it is an autistic thing or not, but certainly every autistic person I know sense of humor is extraordinarily dark, kind of gallows humor, you know, and I love that. I always feel like I'm in safe company when people feel, you know, that they can joke, you know, like that. I write poetry, and could I have a career in poetry as an autistic person? Can you get published? How do you go about it? Oh God, that's a good question. Poetry is very difficult to make a career out of because you don't sell many copies. Poetry books don't sell well at all. And because authors' income is entirely based on royalties and advances that are kind of predicated on expected sales, it can be very difficult to make a living out of it. But you know, it's obviously not impossible. I mean, people do manage it. So what I'd say is you're just going to need to have other income streams as well, like other writing gigs that you do, like copywriting, that kind of thing can help, you know, just kind of, you know, writing copy for websites and stuff like that. And yeah, it's hard enough for novelists, but poets have got the worst deal in the world because people just don't buy poetry. As sad as it is, they just don't. You know, you look at a poetry section in Waterstones and it's like one small bit of shelving, you know, whereas everything else is, you know, shelf after shelf after shelf. So yeah, it's a difficult one, but you know, good luck. And you know, the key is to keep your options open and to have a few different fingers in different pies financially. You know, different income streams coming in if you can. Any other questions? I'll just open the chat again. That all went a bit strange for me a moment ago as well. There's nothing in there.
Pete, we've got one observation in the room.
Okay, that's great.
Hi, it's me again. You mentioned about not understanding how people get into small models.
Yes.
It's I'm actually with Models for Heroes, which is a military and blue light based CIC that provides these models for benefits of mental health. Because once you start modeling, you go into your special place in the back of your head, and time disappears. And you know, it, I don't know, maybe other people that know me that could probably explain it better, but you forget the real world while you're doing it.
Yeah, I think that's very true, isn't it? I mean, it's the flow state for a start, but I think there's something about miniatures that the detail required and the amount of focus you have to put into whatever it might be that you're doing, whether you're gluing something together or you're doing landscaping on your railway or you're painting a soldier or whatever it is. There's a level of focus that's so high to do that well. You know, you have to be so utterly focused that everything does drop away. And of course, the finished result is pleasing, isn't it? You know, it's an achievement, you know, and it looks nice. So I think so. I didn't know that existed. That's such a good idea for a CIC. That's really cheered me up, because just as a concept, it's fantastic. I've noticed I've frozen on the screen. Can I still?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
Pete?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I suppose I hate talking about theories and stuff and theoretical underpinnings, but I think there is also central coherence, which sort of does fit in with monotropism as well. And I think that, you know, attention to detail. But I'm going to take that question. We've got a group here called the Axia Collective, which is made up of a cross-section of people in Axia, and I've put that on the agenda for our next meeting to try and put the big brains we've got in that group to start thinking about why miniature.
Yeah.
So if we get any thoughts, Pete, we'll send them back to you.
Oh, lovely, thank you.
Any other questions? Can I ask people virtually and face-to-face to thank Pete in whatever manner you like to thank people. And Pete, many thanks indeed. One thing you were going to do was about your book and a raffle.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, what I'll do is I'll get a list of attendees from Axia once they've managed to tot up everyone that's been here, you know, physically and electronically, and then I'll just do a random number selection thing on Excel, you know, and just choose a random person who'll get a copy of my book.
Marvellous. Thank you. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you at the next Post-Diagnostic Support Group in June, which is going to be myself and Esme, assistant psychologist. This is going to sound really weird. The presentations on dissociative identity disorder. That this was requested after apparently there's an outbreak on TikTok, which I don't go on, around dissociative identity disorder and autism, and we're going to blow away some of the myths about that, but also talk about dissociation, post-traumatic stress disorder. I saw the presentation yesterday. I think it's going to be very interesting, very thought-provoking. I don't fully understand it myself, and I'm certainly not going on TikTok. However, Esme, who is considerably younger, has spent a lot of time thinking about how we embrace things like TikTok, but also how we address some of the misinformation. So, Pete, if you wanted to join us virtually for that one, it'd be very much, you know, if you want to...
if I'm available, I'd love to, yeah.
Great. Okay, so Evie, could you give Pete the details of that? And we've got it on the agenda for the Axia Collective, and if we get any bright ideas, I'm looking at some of the Axia Collective members here, start thinking about this miniature representation. What is that all about? Okay, Pete, many thanks. and I'll continue to follow you on LinkedIn if that's all right.
That's fine by me, no problem at all.
Good.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Pete. Cheers.
Bye then.